February 26, 1991. Highway 80, Kuwait. Iraqi Republican Guard tank crews raced north toward Basra in full retreat. The ground war had begun 52 hours earlier. Coalition forces were advancing faster than Iraqi commanders had believed possible. Orders came down the chain of command: withdraw before being encircled. The convoy stretched for miles: T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, trucks carrying ammunition and supplies. Darkness provided cover. Iraqi doctrine promised that night operations protected ground forces from air attack. The tankers were wrong. 4,000 meters to the south, Chief Warrant Officer Don Denton adjusted his Apache's target acquisition and designation site, centering the thermal crosshairs on an Iraqi T-72 tank. The tank glowed white-hot on Denton's FLIR display, its engine heat signature clearly visible despite complete darkness covering the Kuwaiti desert. Denton designated the target with his laser. The Hellfire missile locked. He squeezed the trigger. The missile dropped from the Apache's wing pylon, ignited its rocket motor, and accelerated toward the tank at supersonic speed. 8 seconds later, the T-72 erupted in flames as the Hellfire's shaped charge warhead penetrated the turret and detonated the ammunition stored inside. The Iraqi tank crew never saw the Apache. They never saw the missile. They died without knowing what weapon had killed them. Denton designated a second target. Another Hellfire launched. Another tank exploded. The engagement continued for 8 minutes. 10 Iraqi T-72 tanks destroyed. The Apache never closed within 6,000 meters, 3.5 miles from its targets. Iraqi anti-aircraft guns remained silent because their crews couldn't see the attacker. The technological gap between what Iraqi forces expected and what American forces delivered was measured in thousands of meters and hundreds of destroyed vehicles. For the Iraqi military, helicopter warfare doctrine came from 8 years of combat experience during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. Iranian AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters had attacked Iraqi ground forces throughout the conflict. Iraqi air defense forces learned to counter helicopter threats with ZSU-23-4 Shilka anti-aircraft guns that could engage targets out to 2,500 meters, and SA-7 Strela shoulder-fired missiles effective to 3,000 meters. The lessons were clear. Helicopters needed to close within 1,500 meters to engage effectively with rockets and guns, bringing them into range where Iraqi defensive weapons could return fire. Iraqi expectations about American helicopter capabilities were based on Soviet doctrine that assumed attack helicopters operated as flying artillery, close support weapons that suppressed enemy positions with rockets and cannon fire. The tactics required helicopters to approach target areas, expose themselves briefly during attack runs, then retreat to cover before defensive fires became effective. Iraqi ground forces trained to engage helicopters with concentrated anti-aircraft fire during these vulnerable attack runs. The doctrine was sound against helicopters operating according to Soviet tactical assumptions. It was completely inadequate against Apache capabilities that Iraqi intelligence had never properly assessed. Iraqi doctrine also held that mobile convoys could escape air attacks by dispersing when threatened, and that nighttime operations provided protection from aerial observation. These assumptions reflected experience where aircraft needed visual contact to identify and engage targets. Iranian F-4 Phantoms attacking during daylight could be evaded by dispersing forces across wide areas. Night provided natural concealment because aircraft couldn't locate targets they couldn't see. Iraqi commanders planned their retreat from Kuwait, believing that moving at night would minimize casualties from American air power. Iraqi Republican Guard forces withdrawing from Kuwait represented Iraq's most capable military units. They were equipped with Soviet-supplied T-72 tanks mounting 125mm guns, BMP-1 and BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, and mobile SA-8 Gecko surface-to-air missile systems designed to protect ground forces from air attack. The Iraqi belief was straightforward. American helicopters were vulnerable. Night operations provided protection, and mobile formations moving quickly toward Iraqi territory would escape before coalition forces could mass sufficient firepower to stop them. What Iraqi forces didn't understand was that the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter represented a revolutionary departure from conventional helicopter design philosophy. The Apache wasn't flying artillery designed for close support. It was a precision strike platform optimized for destroying armored vehicles at standoff ranges that made return fire impossible. Boeing and Hughes helicopters had designed the Apache specifically to counter Soviet armored forces in European conflict scenarios, where American forces would face numerical disadvantage against Warsaw Pact tanks. Every system on the aircraft prioritized one mission: killing tanks before they could engage friendly forces. The Apache's armament centered on the AGM-114 Hellfire missile. Each helicopter carried 16 Hellfire missiles on wing pylons, 8 per side. The Hellfire was a laser-guided precision weapon with an effective range of 8,000 meters. The missile used semi-active laser homing guidance, meaning the Apache's laser designator illuminated the target with invisible infrared laser energy, and the missile's seeker head tracked the reflected laser light until impact. The Hellfire's shaped charge warhead could penetrate any tank armor in Iraqi inventory, destroying T-72s, T-62s, and T-55s with single hits. Secondary armament included a 30mm M230 chain gun mounted under the Apache's nose with 200 rounds of ammunition. The cannon was effective against lightly armored vehicles, trucks, and infantry positions. Hydra 70 unguided rockets in 19-round pods provided area suppression capability. But the Hellfire was the primary weapon, the system that gave Apache its tank-killing reputation, and the reason Iraqi armored forces faced such devastating losses during Desert Storm. The revolutionary technology that made Apache effective at night and in adverse weather was the TADS PNVS system, Target Acquisition and Designation Sight, combined with Pilot Night Vision System. The TADS turret mounted under the Apache's nose contained forward-looking infrared sensors that detected heat signatures from engines, exhaust systems, and warm vehicle hulls. FLIR transformed darkness into clear imagery, where hot objects appeared white and cool objects appeared black. An Iraqi tank's engine glowed brilliantly on FLIR displays even in complete darkness or through smoke and dust that blocked visible light. The co-pilot gunner operated TADS from the Apache's front seat, scanning for targets and designating them with the laser system. The pilot in the rear seat used PNVS, a separate FLIR system that provided forward view for navigation and allowed nap-of-earth flight in darkness. The combination meant Apache crews could fly at night, navigate using terrain features invisible to the naked eye, locate enemy vehicles by their heat signatures, and engage with precision-guided weapons, all while remaining invisible to enemy forces who lacked equivalent thermal imaging technology. Apache armor protection exceeded conventional helicopter standards. The crew compartment could withstand 23mm cannon hits. Critical systems were redundant or armored. The aircraft could sustain significant battle damage and continue flying. Maximum speed reached 182 miles per hour. Combat radius extended to 300 miles, allowing deep strikes into enemy territory. The Apache represented a quantum leap in attack helicopter capability, engaging tanks beyond their visual range, fighting effectively at night, surviving hits that would destroy earlier generation helicopters. The Apache's combat debut came on January 17, 1991, the first night of Operation Desert Storm. 9 Apache helicopters from the 101st Airborne Division crossed into Iraq before the main air campaign began. Their mission was to destroy Iraqi early warning radar sites that covered the approaches to Baghdad. The radar stations needed to be eliminated to create a corridor through which F-117 stealth fighters could penetrate to strike command bunkers and communications facilities in the Iraqi capital. The Apaches flew nap-of-earth at night using PNVS to navigate at altitudes below 100 feet. Iraqi radar couldn't detect helicopters flying that low. Iraqi observers couldn't see helicopters in complete darkness. At 2:38 a.m., the Apaches reached their attack positions and fired 27 Hellfire missiles at the radar installations. Every missile hit its target. The radar sites were destroyed within seconds. F-117s flew through the gap minutes later. The war had begun with Apache demonstrating capabilities that would be repeated hundreds of times during the 100-hour ground campaign. Between February 24 and February 28, 1991, when the ground war was fought, 277 Apache helicopters from the 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, and 1st Armored Division hunted Iraqi armor across Kuwait and southern Iraq. The Apaches operated in teams, coordinating with ground forces to identify concentrations of Iraqi vehicles and engaging them with Hellfire missiles before Iraqi forces could threaten coalition ground advances. February 26th became known as the Day of the Highway of Death. Iraqi forces attempting to retreat from Kuwait City toward Basra were caught on Highway 80 by coalition air power. The convoy stretched for miles. Thousands of vehicles, including military equipment and civilian cars, stolen from Kuwait. Apache helicopters attacked the convoy throughout the day and into the night, destroying over 200 vehicles in a few hours of sustained engagement. The Apaches engaged from standoff ranges where Iraqi defensive weapons couldn't return effective fire. Hellfire engagements followed consistent patterns. Apache crews identified targets using FLIR thermal imaging. The co-pilot Josh Gunner designated targets with the laser system. Hellfire missiles were launched from 6,000 to 8,000 meters, 4 to 5 miles from the target. Iraqi tank crews had no indication they were being targeted until their vehicles exploded. The shaped charge warheads penetrated armor and detonated ammunition stores, destroying tanks completely. Many Iraqi vehicles exploded so violently that turrets were blown dozens of feet into the air. Night operations demonstrated Apache's most decisive advantage. Iraqi forces, equipped with optical sights and visual observation, couldn't see attackers in darkness. FLIR thermal imaging saw through smoke from burning vehicles, dust from artillery strikes, and darkness that blinded Iraqi forces completely. Apache crews described engagements where they methodically destroyed entire tank companies, while Iraqi crews attempted to return fire towards sounds of explosions without ever seeing the helicopters attacking them. Chief Warrant Officer Don Denton's mission on February 26th exemplified Apache effectiveness. Denton's Apache engaged a column of retreating Iraqi T-72 tanks from 7,000 meters range. 10 tanks were destroyed in 8 minutes. Each Hellfire missile found its target. Iraqi tanks exploded one after another as Denton walked his fire down the column. The engagement ended when Denton ran out of designated targets, rather than when Iraqi forces mounted effective defense. The Iraqi tank company ceased to exist without landing a single hit on Denton's Apache. The running tally of Iraqi vehicle destruction exceeded pre-war predictions. Over 500 armored vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, were confirmed destroyed by Apache Hellfire missiles during the 100-hour ground campaign. The actual number was likely higher because many vehicles were destroyed in conditions where battle damage assessment was incomplete. Hundreds of trucks, artillery pieces, and support vehicles were destroyed by Apache 30mm cannon fire and Hydra rockets. The devastation inflicted on Iraqi ground forces by 277 helicopters operating for 100 hours demonstrated lethality that exceeded conventional ground forces by orders of magnitude. 0 Apache helicopters were lost to enemy fire during the ground campaign. Several Apaches were damaged by ground fire, but all returned to base. A few helicopters were lost to accidents, one to fratricide from friendly anti-aircraft fire, others to mechanical failures or pilot error. But Iraqi air defenses failed to shoot down a single Apache in combat, despite thousands of anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of surface-to-air missiles deployed across Kuwait and southern Iraq. The survivability statistics validated Apache design philosophy. Standoff weapons and thermal imaging allowed engagement beyond effective defensive range. Iraqi survivors of Apache attacks described the psychological impact in interviews conducted after the war. One Republican Guard tank commander reported, "We heard explosions all around us. Tanks were exploding. We never saw the helicopters. We fired our machine guns into the darkness but had no targets. It was night. We were helpless." Another Iraqi officer described, American helicopters attacked at night when we couldn't see them. Our tanks were destroyed one by one. The crews didn't know where the attacks came from. We just heard missiles and explosions. The technological gap that enabled Apache dominance was measured in engagement ranges, sensor capabilities, and weapon precision that Iraqi forces trained on Soviet doctrine couldn't counter. Hellfire missiles engaged from 8,000 meters, 5 miles. Iraqi ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft guns were effective to 2,500 meters, less than 2 miles. Apache engaged from ranges where Iraqi defensive weapons couldn't return fire. The 5,500-meter gap in effective engagement range meant Apache could destroy Iraqi vehicles with virtual impunity. Iraqi forces were night-blind. Soviet-supplied tanks and infantry vehicles used optical sights that required visible light. Infrared night vision devices were rare in Iraqi inventory and far inferior to American thermal imaging. Iraqi forces operating at night relied on natural moonlight, vehicle-mounted searchlights that revealed their positions to Apache FLIR sensors, or simply waited for dawn before operating effectively. Apache FLIR saw heat signatures with clarity that made night combat as effective as daylight operations, actually more effective because Iraqi forces couldn't return accurate fire toward attackers they couldn't see. Iraqi mobile surface-to-air missiles like the SA-8 Gecko system relied on radar guidance to track targets. Apache tactics exploited terrain masking, flying nap of earth behind ridges and hills that blocked radar detection. Apaches would pop up briefly to launch Hellfire missiles, then descend behind cover before SA-8 systems could complete their engagement sequences. The combination of low-altitude flight, terrain masking, and standoff weapons defeated mobile air defense systems, designed to protect against aircraft flying predictable approach profiles at medium to high altitudes. Iraqi helicopter defense doctrine was based on Soviet training that assumed helicopters close to 1,500 meters or less to engage with rockets and guns. Soviet attack helicopter tactics emphasized surprise, speed, and massed firepower delivered at close range during brief attack runs. Iraqi forces trained to mass anti-aircraft fire during these vulnerable moments when helicopters exposed themselves. The doctrine worked against helicopters operating according to Soviet assumptions. It was useless against Apache tactics, where engagement ranges exceeded 6,000 meters and helicopters remained masked by terrain between missile launches. Hellfire precision represented another technology gap Iraqi forces hadn't anticipated. Soviet anti-tank guided missiles like the AT-3 Saga used wire guidance or radio command systems that achieved hit probabilities around 50 to 70% under ideal conditions. Hellfire laser guidance achieved hit probabilities exceeding 90% in combat conditions. Apache could destroy individual tanks with single missiles rather than requiring multiple shots per target. The precision meant Apache crews could destroy more vehicles with fewer missiles, extending combat endurance and increasing lethality. The Apache continued service in conflicts following Desert Storm, Bosnia in the 1990s, Afghanistan from 2001 onwards, and Iraq again during Operation Iraqi Freedom from 2003 to 2011. Apache helicopters provided close air support and anti-armor capability in every major American ground operation. The basic design proved sound enough that upgraded variants remain frontline equipment decades after initial deployment. The AH-64E model, introduced in 2011, features improved engines, upgraded sensors, Link 16 data links for network-centric warfare, and compatibility with new weapon systems, while retaining the fundamental capabilities that made Apache effective in Desert Storm. Export versions of Apache serve with 18 nations, including the United Kingdom, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. The helicopter's combat record in Desert Storm created international demand for equivalent capability. Nations facing armored threats or requiring precision strike capability against ground targets purchased Apache despite high cost, approximately $30 million per aircraft with weapons and support equipment. The export success validated American helicopter design philosophy and demonstrated that other nations recognized Apache as representing a capability they couldn't develop independently within acceptable timeframes. Iraq never developed effective countermeasures against Apache tactics. Subsequent conflicts showed that attack helicopters with standoff weapons and thermal imaging had become standard capability that ground forces needed to account for in operational planning. Iraqi forces in 2003 during Operation Iraqi Freedom faced the same Apache threat they'd encountered in 1991, with no better ability to defend against night attacks from extended ranges. The technology gap identified in Desert Storm persisted because Iraqi military acquisition couldn't procure equivalent systems, and Iraqi tactical doctrine couldn't adapt to threats operating outside parameters that Soviet training had prepared them to counter. The 100-hour ground war that destroyed Iraqi forces in Kuwait demonstrated Apache as a decisive weapon against armored formations. Coalition ground forces advanced rapidly in part because Apache helicopters eliminated Iraqi armor that would have slowed the advance. The psychological impact of facing invisible attackers that struck without warning degraded Iraqi morale and contributed to widespread surrenders. Tank crews who survived Apache attacks described the helplessness of being hunted by enemies they couldn't see or engage effectively. Iraqi forces in February 1991 defended against threats they understood from 8 years of war against Iran. They had experience with helicopters. They knew how to engage aircraft with anti-aircraft guns and missiles. They had trained for armored combat, where visual acquisition of targets preceded engagement. Their doctrine was sound, for warfare that matched their experience and training. They were utterly unprepared for Apache helicopters that engaged from 8,000 meters in complete darkness using thermal imaging sensors that penetrated night, smoke, and dust with clarity that made darkness irrelevant. The technological gap wasn't measured in maximum speed or armor thickness or raw firepower. It was measured in engagement range, the distance at which Apache could kill Iraqi vehicles while remaining beyond the range where Iraqi weapons could return fire. It was measured in sensor capability, thermal imaging that saw heat signatures through conditions that blinded Iraqi optical sights. It was measured in weapon precision, laser-guided missiles that destroyed individual tanks with single shots versus the area weapons and unguided munitions Iraqi forces employed. Iraq had defended against 1980s helicopter threats that closed to 1,500 meters to engage with rockets and guns. Apache engaged from 8,000 meters, 5 miles away, in 1991. Iraqi tankers faced invisible attackers striking from distances where return fire was impossible. The gap wasn't distance alone. It was thermal imaging technology that turned night into American advantage and laser guidance that made every missile a guaranteed kill. Iraqi ground forces trained for threats they understood. Apache represented capabilities that Soviet doctrine had never prepared them to counter, and the difference was measured in 500 vehicles destroyed in 100 hours, while Apache losses to enemy fire totaled 0.